Greetings everyone, and good morning, afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to the third installment of my Chronicles of Narnia series. We have a special treat lined up for today as we are going through one of my favorites, The Horse and His Boy, or rather the Swedish title that we have here that we shall ignore. I have been super excited to share this one, but before we start, I'd like to make a quick comment on the timeline. So in the previous book, we saw these Pevensey siblings be crowned kings and queens of Narnia. Now, The Horse and His Boy is set during their reign, but in early adulthood, one could say. So we're all clear about that. So without further ado, make yourself comfortable with a nice cup of tea, or snacks, or dinner, or anything else that suits your fancy, and let's get into it. This looks too hot to drink yet. Chapter 1. A Horse Meets a Boy. There was a land far to the south of Narnia called Calormen, and that is where this story begins. There lived a poor fisherman named Ashish, along with his son Shasta. Now, Shasta's life was rather challenging. His job was to stay at home at their cottage, washing and mending fishing nets, and cleaning and cooking their meals, as his father was out catching or selling fish. When he came home, his father would simply ignore him, if he was in a good mood, that is. And if he was in a bad mood, he would beat him. And there was usually something at fault with Shasta, so that was the more common outcome. One day, a stranger arrived at their seaside cottage. It was clear that he was a Tarkan, meaning a warrior lord of high standing. He rode a strong war steed and carried fine weapons and armor. Ashish and Shasta both kneeled to the ground before him in respect. He demanded their hospitality for the night, and so Ashish had no choice but to agree. So Shasta was then given some bread and was turned out of the house to go and sleep with the donkey in the shed. But it was too early to go to sleep, so Shasta entertained himself by eavesdropping on the adults through a crack in the cottage wall. And lo and behold, he overheard the Tarkan wanting to buy him as his slave. At first, Ashish made a feeble attempt at being shocked, but the Lord wasn't fooled. He said, "This boy is manifestly no son of yours, for your cheek is as dark as mine, but the boy is fair and white like the accursed but beautiful barbarians who inhabit the remote north." And thus Ashish told the story of how he had found a boat at the shore one night, several years ago. In the boat was a man who had recently passed away, as well as a baby who was still alive. So yes, that is how Shasta found out that he was not in fact Ashish's son. And once this confession was out of the way, the two men proceeded to haggle over his price. Shasta had heard enough. Not only was his father not actually his father, but he was also willing to sell him. But Shasta wasn't upset. On the contrary, in fact. He was excited and relieved. He had never loved Ashish as he knew a boy ought to love his father, and here was the reason. He walked up to the Tarkan's horse as it was grazing by the shed, thinking out loud what sort of life he will live as the slave of a Tarkan. Maybe he would treat him better than Ashish ever did. But what if he was cruel? He looked at the horse, thinking that the horse most likely knew what sort of fate awaited him, and he said, "I wish you could talk, old fellow." And to his great astonishment, the horse replied, "But I can." Then the horse revealed that he was from a land called Narnia, where many animals could talk. He had been captured as a foal when he had strayed too far south against his mother's warnings. So he had spent nearly his whole life in Calormen, hiding his true nature and pretending to be just a regular war horse. He then said that his master was a terribly cruel man and that Shasta should rather wish for death than to ever be a slave in his house. Shasta turned pale, saying that he should run away. The horse then suggested that they should run away together. He too had been looking for an opportunity to run away, but he needed a rider, otherwise people would just think he's a stray horse and capture him. He wanted to run north to his home country of Narnia, and one look at Shasta's fair hair and skin told him that he was of northern descent as well. So it was settled. After some challenges involving Shasta putting on a saddle and bridle as quietly as possible, as well as getting up on the tall horse's back, they finally set off into the night. They made sure to leave behind some obvious hoof prints leading south, but as soon as they reached the river, they turned their direction upstream towards the mountain ridge. This is when they make their introductions, and we find out that the horse's name is Bree, or rather, Bree-hi-hini-brini-hoo-hi-ha, but Bree for short. They set off into a gallop, and eventually all that Shasta had ever known was far out of sight. Chapter 2: An Unexpected Encounter. The next day, Shasta was sore and grumpy from the hard night's ride, and he munched on some food he had found in the saddlebag, while Bree had some grass to keep him company. But before they got back to the road, Bree made sure to have a little roll in the grass, waving his legs in the air. He recommended that Shasta do the same, but Shasta burst out laughing, telling him how funny it looked. Bree then looked at him anxiously. Did it really look that funny? What if this was something that talking horses never do? What if this was a bad habit he had picked up from the dumb, non-talking horses? He urged Shasta to share his opinion. Honestly now, don't spare my feelings, he said. But Shasta, however, had no other opinion than to keep going, and so they got the saddle and the bridle back on and got back on the road. They went at a slower pace this time, as Shasta was in a lot of pain. When they arrived at a village, Shasta dismounted and went inside to buy himself some food with the money he found in the saddlebag, and Bree would round the village and meet him on the other side. They did this every other night or so, and several days passed in this pattern. Shasta also became a better rider as his muscles hardened and he received instructions from Bree. Because, let's be honest, no one can teach riding as well as a horse. During their rides, Bree would tell Shasta stories of the battles he had participated in with his former master. This went on for weeks, until one moonlit night, Bree suddenly stopped and twitched his ears. He had heard something close by. It was another horse, and he could tell by the sound that it was a proper horse with a skilled rider. They stopped to listen, and by the sound of it, so did the other rider. Then, out of nowhere, a snarling roar followed, causing Bree to gallop as fast as he could. 2 lions were pursuing both Shasta and Bree, as well as the other mysterious rider. The other rider came closer, and Shasta noticed that he wore armor, but was quite small for a warrior lord. Eventually, they lost the pursuing lions by a body of water that they swam across. And suddenly, Shasta heard not one, but 2 voices next to him. The first voice expressed that they were tired, and the second voice told the first one to hold their tongue. Could it be? Was it another talking horse? What are the odds of that? Bree and Shasta immediately confronted them, and Shasta soon noticed that the Tarkan, or warrior lord, on the other horse was only a girl, similar to his own age. And they find out that they were on the run to get to Narnia as well. The girl's name was Aravis, and the horse was a mare called Gwyn, who had, just like Bree, been taken captive from Narnia to live a life of slavery in Calormen. The horses took immediate liking to each other and wanted to team up. They were, after all, 2 free Narnians in a foreign land. But the humans wasn't too keen on the idea. But they went along with it. So they stop to rest, and Aravis tells them the story of how her evil stepmother had arranged for her to marry the Tarkan Ahoshta, who was at least 60, had a hump on his back, and a face which resembled an ape. So Aravis then rode out on her horse, Win, with the intention of ending her life alone in the woods. That is when her horse had spoken to her for the first time, pleading for her not to go through with it. She had then told Aravis that she was a talking horse from Narnia, which led to their plan of running away there together, living a free life. Aravis had then conducted a plan which involved giving her slave girl some wine with a sleeping potion in it, and forged a letter that was to give her a few extra days before her father began searching for her. Shasta then asked what happened to the slave girl after Aravis had run away, but Aravis answered nonchalantly that she would have been beaten for sleeping late, but that was fine. She was a spy for her stepmother anyway. Bree then went on to tell the story of how Shasta and him had joined up, and once that was done, they all went to sleep. Chapter 3: The City of Tashbaan. The next day, the 2 horses and 2 humans continued their journey together. Now, Bree and Aravis had so many things to talk about, as he had been around Tarkans for years, and Aravis was a Tarkina with many relations that he also knew about. So Shasta felt left out and became rather sulky, which is understandable. After passing more and bigger cities, which also required more stealth to keep out of sight, they finally arrived at the most dangerous obstacle of their journey, the capital city of Tashbaan. They had to pass through it to get to the other side, which was the desert that led to Archenland and eventually Narnia. So they disguised themselves as ruggedly as possible, even the horses, and all the fancy goods like Aravis's armor and the saddles and bridles were put into sacks and onto the horses' backs, and the horses rolled around in mud to look more like farm horses. They also decided that should they get separated, they will meet on the other side of the city by the tombs of the ancient kings. And into Tashbaan they went. At first, Shasta was in awe over its magnificence, having never seen anything like it. They joined the crowd of peasants and donkeys as they were marching through the city gates, and Aravis was uncomfortable. She was a lady of noble birth and should enter the capital in splendor befitting her station, unlike Shasta, as she made sure to point out. The city streets of Tashbaan were narrow, crowded, and smelly, and many a time were they forced to stop and wait for some noble or royal vizier or ambassador along with their attendants to pass. But then something quite unexpected happened. The crowd was forced to stop, as usual, to make way for the Narnian lords. In all the confusion, Shasta lost hold of Bree and suddenly found himself at the front when the Narnian party walked by. One of the Narnian lords stopped and pulled Shasta towards him, gave him a smack in the face, and told him how naughty he had been for running away. This lord was actually none other than King Edmund, whom we got to know in the previous book. Yes, the one with the Turkish delight. And so they marched off with Shasta, saying that Queen Susan had been crying since his disappearance. Shasta was completely mute from confusion, and it didn't get better once they arrived at the Narnians' guest palace. Everyone kept calling him Corin, and how his behavior was ill-fitting a prince of Archenland. And then there was a curious creature who was half man, half goat, who said that Corin, in this case Shasta, had clearly been out in the sun too long. He needed rest and refreshments. This then led to everyone quitting their scolding and started pampering him with pillows and delicious cold drinks and told him to rest. And so he did, all the while listening to the conversations that followed. King Edmund addressed Queen Susan, his sister, asking whether she had made up her mind. Was she to marry the Calormene Prince Rabadash or not? But Susan was quite clear in that she intended to refuse him, and even though Edmund was glad to hear it, it also worried him. Their party had been treated with utmost respect when Prince Rabadash thought Susan was to accept his marriage proposal, but once he learns of her refusal, they will be in danger. Edmund had met with the prince that morning, and he showed all the signs of a threatening and spoiled personality when not given his way, and he had showed his anger over Susan's delay quite openly. So this, along with some poorly veiled threats, made it seem like the prince would do anything in his power to stop Susan from leaving, and perhaps even declare war against Narnia. They went on to discuss the possibility of Calormen attacking by sea or by land, where they coincidentally started talking about the best possible route one could take going west through the desert and into Archenland. And Shasta, of course, committed every single detail to memory. They then had to decide on how to get out of Calormen safely, and the goatman, Mr. Tumnus, came up with the idea of inviting the spoiled, dangerous prince to a banquet at the Narnian ship. So then no one would ask any questions if they were seen going down to their ship along with supplies and things. And then they would set sail in the night before the fake banquet was to take place. Prince Rabadash would surely try to follow, but there was no ship in the docks currently that could match their own in speed. So they all left to start making arrangements, thus leaving Shasta all alone. Chapter 4: The Prince of Archenland. Shasta was now quite terrified, as he very well couldn't reveal his identity now that he had heard their plans. But even so, they would surely kill him once the real Prince Corin showed up. Which, of course, we as readers know they wouldn't, but Shasta had grown up in an abusive situation, so it was natural for him to distrust adults. So Shasta then ate a delicious meal, kind of making him wish the real Corin wouldn't show up, because then he could live like a prince for the rest of his life. And then he fell asleep. He woke up from a loud crash some hours later and found a boy around his own age climbing through a window where he accidentally had toppled over a vase on the way in. The boy had a black eye and a missing tooth, and his clothes were torn and filthy. He looked at Shasta and asked, "Who are you?" Shasta in return asked whether this was Corin, which the boy confirmed, and then repeated his question. Shasta only explained that the others had mistaken him for him, Corin, and asked him whether he could get out the same way that Corin had got in. But Corin wasn't about to let him go so easily. This could be so much fun, switching places and acting as one another. Shasta asked where Corin had been all day, and he casually told him of how he had got into various street fights with people until he was locked up somewhere, but he managed to bribe his way out, and then found the initial guy he had fought with and knocked him down once again. He had made some crude joke about Queen Susan, and he couldn't have that, could he? Shasta then told him frantically about the departing plans he had heard from the Narnians, and as Corin asked yet again who he was, he merely answered that he was a northerner of sorts, but he had been brought up in Calormen, and now he was on the run to Narnia with a talking horse named Bree. So Corin then relented and gave him detailed instructions on how to climb down safely to the streets from where they were. The two boys then bid farewell, and as Shasta then dropped down from the window, Corin said that he hoped they'd see each other again in Archenland someday. He could come to his father's castle, Anvard, and say that he was a friend of his. Shasta then left the palace according to Corin's instructions, and from the rooftop view he knew exactly how to get to the northern city gate, which in turn led to the meetup place that he had decided on with the others. And he quietly and nimbly made his way through narrow streets until he passed through the gate and went down an old road to the ancient tombs. The sun was setting as he reached the tombs, and he found that there was nobody there waiting for him. It was just Shasta, the tombs, and an ocean of desert on the other side. A dreadful sound followed. It was that of the horn which announced the gates to be closed for the night. And now he knew that he would have to spend the night all alone out here in a graveyard. What a terrible, terrible idea. And it was not a very pleasant night indeed. In the darkness, the tombs were far too eerie, and Shasta was reminded of stories of ghouls coming out there in the night. He became terribly frightened, but then a cat showed up, and he followed it to the edge of the desert where it stopped. So he lay down to sleep with his back against the cat, feeling somewhat less alone and scared. But then he woke up in the middle of the night from some terrible animal noises, and they were getting closer to him. But suddenly something huge seemed to jump out and roared at the animals, scaring them off. The mysterious creature then approached Shasta, who was beside himself from fear. But then it laid down by his feet, and he realized that it was just the cat. He must have been dreaming the whole thing. And then the next day came, and Shasta spent all of it anxiously waiting for his companions, but there was no sign of them. Until the sun began to set once again. Now he saw Bree and Hwin being led down to the tombs, but by a man, and there was no sign of Aravis. Chapter 5. Aravis at the Palace. We have to rewind a little bit here to the moment where Shasta was taken away by the Narnians. Aravis had stood there, holding on to both horses, heart hammering in her chest. But before she could even collect her thoughts, the crowd was forced to stop once again for another noble that was carried on a litter through the streets. This time it was a young lady, a Tarkina, named Lasaralin, and Aravis knew her well. They were old friends, and the moment their eyes met, she called out for Aravis, asking what on earth she was doing there. Everyone knew of her disappearance, and her father was in the capital looking for her. Aravis acted without hesitation. She swung herself up on her friend's litter and urged her to help her, closing the curtains around them. Now, Lasaralin was a rather vain young lady, and she clearly disliked not being seen and admired by the peasants, but she agreed to take Aravis home with her, along with the two horses. Once back at her friend's luxurious home, Aravis told her of her plan to run away to Narnia, and even though Lasaralin couldn't understand this decision, she eventually agreed to help her get out of the city. Now, the two horses wouldn't be a problem. She could just send one of her groomsmen with them, and no one would ask any questions. Getting Aravis out of the city, however, would be more of an issue. She couldn't just be carried outside in the litter with the curtains closed, as those were only used inside the city and would raise suspicions of the guards. So then it was decided. Lasaralin was a frequent visitor at the palace of the great Tisroc, who was the emperor, and the palace had a private garden leading all the way down to the river. Lasaralin would just bring her there so she could sneak her out that way. Come here. So the following night, the two girls entered the palace to execute their plan. Aravis was dressed as a slave girl with a veil over her face, which made her inconspicuous in the palace. They entered without any problems, and Lasaralin led them through the magnificent maze of corridors and steps, finding the adventure quite fun indeed. But then they had to stop, as on the other end of the corridor came none other than the great Tisroc himself. They hurried inside a dark chamber, and just in time before the door opened, they managed to hide under a sofa. In came His Majesty, the Tisroc, and his son, Prince Rabadash, and none other than the vizier, Ahoshta, who had been Aravis's betrothed. Prince Rabadash was deeply distraught by the sudden departure of the Narnians, and thus Queen Susan, whom he had hoped to marry. Like a spoiled child, he clamored over how much he must have her, and when the Vizier Ahoshta tried to speak reason with him, he proceeded to kick him in the rear. You know, as one does. Rabadash then urged his father to invade the accursed land of Narnia, add it to his own empire, and kill the High King Peter and his siblings. Apart from Queen Susan, for even though she should be duly punished, he still wanted her as his wife. Had to get myself something cold to drink, as it's getting really hot in here with all the candles. Oh well. Now, the Tisroc wasn't too keen on the idea of invading Narnia, but not for the reasons you might think. It had some nasty deity that disguised itself as a lion. It would have to be a sure victory if it was to be worth the risk. So, after some interesting strategic back and forth, Prince Rabadash left with his father's blessing. He was to ride across the desert in the night with 200 soldiers and take Archenland by surprise. With a sudden invasion like this, without any declaration of war, it wouldn't take much for it to fall. Should the prince fail, the Tisroc would simply claim that he knew nothing of it. But should he succeed, Calormen will have Narnia by the throat, and soon within its grasp. Once the plan was established, they left the room where Aravis and Lasaralin were shaking from fear. Lasaralin started crying. She wanted to abort the plan and go back home, but Aravis shook her, making it clear that unless Lasaralin takes her to the agreed location, she will run out to that corridor and scream, getting them both caught and executed. For she would rather die than be married off to Ahoshta. So Lasaralin had to relent and very reluctantly brought her through the moonlit gardens to the unguarded river gate. There they parted ways and Aravis took off in one of the boats towards the old tombs. Chapter 6 From Desert to Archenland. Aravis quickly found the groomsman that had been sent there with the horses, and she paid him and gave him permission to leave. Not that he complained. He was also thinking about the ghouls. As soon as he was gone, Shasta came out of hiding from behind the tombs. Aravis then quickly told everyone about what she had learned of Prince Rabadash attacking Archenland, so they made their way swiftly into the desert. There was no time to lose. Thankfully, Shasta now knew the best way from having listened to the Narnians talking about it earlier, but that didn't make the journey across the desert any easier. They rode all night and all of the following day through the terrible burning heat, only taking one short break for some food and water. Then they continued until the next night fell, and that's when Shasta finally saw the mountain pass he had been looking for. So into that they went, and to their great relief, there was a valley with grass and a stream on the other side. After cooling themselves off in the water, they had a bit of rest, and consequently, they all fell asleep from exhaustion. They continued the following day for several hours down the valley until they reached a river which Bree recognized as the Winding Arrow River, meaning that they were now officially in Archenland. Climbing up another mountain ridge, they now saw Prince Rabadash's army in the far distance, galloping towards their target, the Anvard castle where King Lune resides, as well as a certain Prince Corin. They picked up the speed so that they could reach Anvard before Rabadash, and as the horses were galloping, a dreadful sound appeared behind them. It was the roar of a lion. Shasta looked behind him and saw the huge animal chasing them, and when he turned his head forward, he found that, just ahead of them, an old man was standing by an open gate. As odd as this was, Shasta saw that the lion was almost upon Aravis and Wynne, who screamed and galloped as hard as she could, but the lion was too fast. Without knowing how or why, Shasta jumped off from Bree's back to go and help the others. Not that there was anything he could do against a lion, but still. The lion made a huge leap to attack, and Shasta saw its claws reaching for Aravis. She screamed, and Shasta shouted at the lion to go away. To be fair, Shasta knew this was a bad idea, but to his surprise, the lion actually turned and left. So they entered through the gate with the old man, who welcomed them and helped Aravis to dismount, as her back was covered in blood. The old man introduced himself as the hermit of the Southern March and told Shasta that he alone will have to continue if they are to warn King Lune in time before the attack. Aravis was injured, and the two horses were so spent that they had collapsed from exhaustion. So Shasta had no choice. He set off in the direction given to him by the hermit and ran as fast as he could. As soon as Shasta had left them, the hermit went on to tend to Aravis's wounds. Thankfully, they were not deep, and Aravis was able to walk again the next morning. She met the horses out in the garden where they were staying and found Bree in a low mood. He was beside himself from shame, knowing how he had run for his life from the lion, leaving a mare and a girl behind him, and not even gone back to help when Shasta so bravely turned back. Aravis had also noticed Shasta's brave actions, and she too felt bad for having looked down on him for so long. Who could have known that all this time he had been the best of them? Chapter 7. Shocking News for the King. Shasta ran with all the might he could muster, not stopping for anything, whether it was the stitch in his side, the sweat in his eyes, or the flies in his face. Eventually, he came out from the forest into a large open space. And right there, he ran straight into a hunting party of about 15 men and their horses, all gathered around a figure in the middle who looked like a king. Shasta ran up to them, and the king opened his arms for him, asking what his son was doing there, on foot and in rags. But Shasta had no more time for this. He brushed it off, saying he knows he looks like Prince Corin, but the important thing is that Rabadash is only a stone's throw away with 200 riders. Thankfully, the king believed him, and even though he looked at Shasta curiously, he gave the boy a horse and ordered his men that they all ride back to the castle. The downside was that Shasta had never actually learned how to ride a horse. Bree had always been in charge, so it didn't take long before Shasta and his horse were behind everyone else. And then they were lost in the increasingly dark, misty forest. Soon enough, Rabadash and his 200 riders caught up with him, but he managed to stay out of sight as they passed. So, he knew now the way to the castle of Anvard, but he couldn't exactly go there now, as the king and his people would have likely barricaded themselves inside, and Shasta was now stuck outside with the enemy. So he went along the dark forest road, feeling sorry for himself, until he realized something. He wasn't alone. There was a large creature walking nearby, and he could hear its breathing. After a while of listening in fear, Shasta eventually asked out loud, "Who are you?" And the invisible creature answered, "One who has waited long for you to speak." After having reassurance that the invisible creature wasn't a ghost, Shasta felt comforted and told the creature his whole story. Once finished, the creature corrected him on one particular detail. They had not encountered 3 different lions throughout their journey. There had only been one lion. "But how do you know?" asked Shasta, to which they replied, "I was the lion. I was the lion who forced you to join with Aravis. I was the cat who comforted you among the houses of the dead. I was the lion who drove the jackals from you while you slept. I was the lion who gave the horses the new strength of fear for the last mile so that you could reach King Lune in time." And I was the lion you do not remember, who pushed the boat in which you lay, a child near death, so that it came to shore where a man sat, wakeful at night, to receive you. All of this was quite a lot of information to take in at once, of course, but the first thing that came to Shasta's mind was to ask why he hurt Aravis. But the lion replied that he will only tell Shasta his own story, whereas her story is reserved for her. Then Shasta saw him, taller than the horse and glowing in the dark, the most magnificent, regal-looking lion imaginable. He bowed before him in awe, to which the lion gave him a kiss on his forehead. And then he was gone. Chapter 8: The Battle at Anvard. Shasta saw that he had now reached the other end of the mountain pass, and given all the descriptions he had heard from Bree, the vast open country before him had to be Narnia. And sure enough, he soon came upon several talking animals, as well as a faun and a dwarf, whom he told about the attack at Anvard. A stag took the news and rushed off towards the palace of Cair Paravel to tell them about the attack, and meanwhile the dwarf took Shasta home with him for some food and rest. At the dwarf's cottage he was properly pampered for a full 24 hours before a trumpet was heard outside. There they were met by none other than King Edmund, Queen Lucy, and the Prince of Archenland, Corin. They had also brought many fighters, both human and animal alike, to help ward off the Calormene attack on Archenland. Prince Corin introduced Shasta to the others, saying that it was he that they had mistook for him back in Tashbaan, and it was curious indeed, for the two boys were completely identical. Prince Corin then got Shasta a horse, and the two boys rode together at the rear as the company continued their march towards Archenland. Shasta admitted to Corin that he had been taught how to ride by a talking horse and didn't actually know how to ride a regular one, so Corin gave him instructions. They rode on through the mountain pass until they reached the area surrounding the castle, where they could hear Prince Rabadash's army battering the gate. The Narnians made themselves ready, and before Shasta knew it, he was in the middle of their counterattack. He was quickly thrown off his horse and spent the whole battle fearing for his life, but thankfully it was all over rather quickly. The Narnians were victorious, and the gates of Anvard opened. King Lune shook hands with King Edmund, and a screaming and cursing Rabadash was taken into their custody. Corin then grabbed Shasta and pulled him up to see King Lune, who, to Shasta's great surprise, embraced him and kissed him on both cheeks. It was clear to the king that Shasta was in fact Prince Cor, the long-lost twin brother of Corin. Chapter 9: The Lost Prince Returns. We must now go back to the hermit's cottage, where Aravis, Hwin, and Bree received a visit from Aslan. He told Aravis that it had been he who had injured her, and the pain and blood that he caused her was exactly equal to that which was given to the slave girl whom Aravis had drugged to be able to run away. Aravis understood and felt empathy for the poor girl, for she had grown a lot during her journey with Shasta and the horses. Then Aslan left them, and another visitor came to the hermit's garden. It was Shasta, only he was dressed in fine garments and had attendants with him who announced him as Prince Cor of Archenland. Aravis was shocked, and Shasta, whom we must now call Cor, told her the whole story. Back when he and Corin had been babies, the king and queen had taken them to see a prophet who had told them that he, Cor, was destined to save Archenland from the greatest danger. This did not sit well with one of King Lune's chancellors, who was in fact a spy for the Tisroc of Calormen. So he arranged for a kidnapping of Cor and set sail for Calormen, but King Lune followed behind, and a great battle took place at sea. The king was victorious, but his lost son was nowhere to be found on the ship, for the Chancellor had sent one of his knights in a rowboat with the baby as soon as he realized that the king would catch up with them. And as we know, the knight had died from starvation as the boat came upon a poor fisherman one night with baby Kor inside. After telling his story, Kor then went on to invite Aravis to come and live with them at the castle of Anvard, which she happily accepted, and so the two children and the horses went down there together. Now that the battle was over, King Lune held a great feast outside the castle walls, and it was here that Kor learned that not only was he a prince of Archenland, he was the crown prince. He was a whole 20 minutes older than Corin. Kor was desperately sorry and told his brother that he didn't want it, he would never want to take his inheritance from him, but Corin wouldn't hear of it. He was delighted that he would no longer have to be king. After all, it's princes that have all the fun. But Kor insisted he didn't want to be king, but then Corin literally told him to shut up about it or he'll punch him in the face. And now, what happened to Rabadash? Well, he was being as spoiled and petulant as you'd imagine, even as a prisoner, so Aslan showed up and turned him into a donkey. Yes. With the condition that if he was to appear in the great temple of his capital of Tashbaan on a certain festival, he would turn back into a man. But if he was ever to go more than 10 miles from Tashbaan, he would turn back into a donkey permanently. So King Lune could send Rabadash back home, knowing well that they had nothing more to fear from him. Which was true indeed, for many years later, when Rabadash became Tisroc after his father, he ruled his empire in peace. Not because he didn't want to wage war, on the contrary, but because he was physically incapable of leaving the country. And he certainly couldn't let his generals win his wars for him, because that's how you get overthrown. Over the years, Prince Kor and Prince Corin got in many fights, as siblings do, where Corin was always the victor. Kor and Aravis quarreled as well as the years went on, and when they eventually became adults, they decided to get married, thus making Aravis the next queen of Archenland, and their son ruled as king after them. The talking horses, Bree and Hwin, went home to Narnia and lived happy lives, both of them getting married but not to each other. Everyone remained friends, however, and the horses would frequently travel across the mountain pass to visit Kor and Aravis at Anvard. The end. Chapter 10, My Thoughts. As I mentioned earlier, I absolutely love this story, but it's not without its flaws. One rather big elephant in the room is the casual racism spread throughout the story, which is a bit of a shame. But to be fair, the whole story, or at least the Calormene parts, is quite reminiscent of 1001 Nights in a way, which is a wild read in all possible ways, and if you are to compare the two, Calormen seems fairly innocent in its portrayal, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the Calormenes are often described as a hard, violent people and culture in general. There isn't a single sympathetic Calormene character apart from Aravis, and she's only sympathetic because she doesn't fit in with her culture and is drawn to a more northern lifestyle. And she also gives off strong, not like other girls vibes. But given how old the series is, I'm not so mad at that. It is what it is. All of that being said, I still fell in love with Calormen even as a child. There is a lot of world building here that I absolutely love, even if it is rather cruel and violent. And there are some details sprinkled here and there that soften the otherwise hard impression we get of this culture. For instance, the Calomene people love poetry and will often recite famous verses that hold particular wisdom. They are also known to be well-spoken and very talented storytellers. Now, does that make up for the fact that their society is built by slavery and a relentless desire to gain power over more countries? No, but it's a nice touch. So, let's go through some likes and dislikes. First up, things that I like. Number 1, Calormen as a setting. I can't help it. I found it fascinating even as a child, and that continues to this day. Number 2, the personality of the horses are quite wonderful. Sometimes with animal characters, they are basically written as humans that just so happen to have the body of an animal, if you know what I mean. But not in this series. You could never mistake Bree for anything other than a horse, despite him being very talkative. And I find that really charming. Number 3, the character of Lasraline is absolutely hilarious. She's only in like 2 chapters, but she made quite the impression on me. To the point where my second book, Garden of Silver, has an homage to her in it. I know. I suppose that's a bit random. If you read it, you probably know exactly who I'm referring to. Things I disliked. Number 1, I think it goes without saying, but the negative portrayal of the Calormenes, for sure. Literally everyone is terrible. First off, we have Arshish, who's willing to sell Shasta, a boy he has raised as his own son, and Aravis' father wants to marry her off against her will to an old hunchback vizier. The noblewomen, as shown by Aravis' stepmother and her friend Lasraline, are all materialistic, self-centered opportunists, basically. And the Tisroc, or the emperor, wanting to expand his empire as he hated countries that are free. Does it sound a bit stereotypically evil to you? It would just have been nice if there were at least 1 or 2 more sympathetic characters thrown in there, you know? To not make them all so homogeneously terrible. And that's it, honestly. I can't think of another thing I dislike. I suppose some people would find Shasta to be a rather boring main character, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I also don't see him as the protagonist, so I don't put any particular emphasis on his character. To me, this isn't a story about a boy who met a horse and escaped his terrible life. It's a story about a horse who met a lost boy, and together they found their way back home. And it's absolutely beautiful, in my humble opinion. Now, I desperately want to know what you all think of this book. Am I alone in loving it, or do you feel the same as I do? Please share all of your thoughts in the comments below. Also, don't forget to give the video a like, as it really does help me out. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you back for the next entry in the series.